So welcome back to another edition of the Heart to Heart podcast. My guest today is a returning guest in Ivor Cummins, who's a biochemical engineer. So Ivor, welcome back to the show, brother.
Great to be here, Mike. Nice to be back.
Yeah, I'm happy that you're back too. And just before we get into everything, Ivor, can you give the audience a little bit of a brief background about yourself?
Right. Well, very brief. I did biochemical engineering. I then went into corporate. I quickly specialized in leading teams in complex problem solving, kind of all branches of science and physics, the real gnarly ones. And I just rose up through the ranks and always focused on that. That was my special talent. I did around 15 years of people management as well, but I always switched to leading the teams directly when a major issue would arise. So that was my whole history. And then around 10 years ago, I got blood tests that were quite poor, a few of them, standard blood tests. And I grilled the doctor, and I was surprised that I got very weak answers on, what would cause them and the implications. So I went to a second doctor, and then I went to a professor of medicine, a family link. And I was shocked. I got weak answers all the way, and I got a couple of tests to check out a few proposals, and they were negative. And then I realized I'd have to problem solve this. So I went back to my biochemical roots, ResearchGate, PubMed, and I followed them up and I became obsessed. And after a few weeks, I had the answer. It was excessive carbohydrate. That was pretty clear. And I basically just started eating meat, fish, eggs, and some vegetables and dropped all the carb, orange juice, all the whole grain breads, everything. And in around 8 weeks, my bloods were fantastic. But I also lost around 15 kilos or around 35 pounds. And I wasn't even aiming for that. So I realized there's a huge hole in medicine and nutrition world. The cholesterol stuff, the fat stuff was all nonsense for half a century. And I believed it. I was eating whole grains and avoiding fat. And look where that got me. And then when you switch the other way, it actually fixes everything. So it was amazing. So I got into metabolic health, and eventually I wrote the book with Dr. Gerber, Eat Rich, Live Long. And I traveled all over the world for the last many years, giving talks in nutrition and medical conferences. And then I got into COVID when COVID blew up for similar reasons, because I'm a data guy, and I knew from Diamond Princess cruise ship, I knew that in early March or mid-March that this was going to be a severe flu equivalent and not a whole lot more. But then we know what happened. Everything in the world went insane.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that introduction, Ivor. And before we, do get into metabolic health and COVID today, which probably will be, what we'll focus on most. At the beginning of the show, before we were getting started, you were talking about YouTube and censorship and how they had actually changed some of their laws recently or policies. So can you just tell us, like, what did YouTube change specifically recently that, surprised you?
Right. Well, I forget. I should credit someone on Twitter who's quite prevalent on Twitter, on the right side of the house, tweeted this out and had photos of the actual before and after. So it's legitimate. But what they dropped was there was one thing that you were not allowed to question: the transmission mitigation of the vaccines specifically. And they quietly dropped that one. I guess because it was so obvious they didn't affect transmission, it became untenable. And they quietly dropped questioning the effectiveness of lockdowns. So they dropped that one too. And there was a third one I can't quite recall, but those two were pretty big ones. You get knocked off YouTube previously for questioning any of those things. They dropped them.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had a couple strikes. I mean, luckily when I've appealed, usually it's worked out in my favor, but I don't know why, I've had a couple strikes in the first place anyway. And I'm permanently banned from LinkedIn right now, and that's completely insane.
Same here.
I literally just posted. It's actually ironic what I posted. It's kind of hilarious. So I literally just posted a study, and my entire caption was "data greater than feelings," and everything else that I posted was just a link to a scientific study where I was literally quoting a PubMed study, and that got me banned. So I didn't add anything other than a link to a scientific study, other than data greater than feelings, and that got me kicked off LinkedIn. And then I think there was one time I got like a 24-hour ban or something on Instagram, something like that. Luckily, nothing on Twitter yet. And hopefully now, you know, with Elon on board, I'm not going to be getting kicked off there. But I haven't had anything happen to me on Twitter yet. I know some people have, but that's been the one kind of, I guess, constant for me.
Yeah, I mean, Twitter, I've been quite aggressive, but I've been very careful too. And people were surprised I didn't get a problem with Twitter because I'm so aggressive. But if they looked carefully, I'm quite careful, and Twitter is not the worst. But you're right, LinkedIn is insane. And
Yeah.
I think it's because Microsoft, you know, I think they own LinkedIn, and you know, we know what that connects to.
Yeah.
So it's LinkedIn. I'm off it as well for similar kinds of stuff, but they're the hardest core because I think the system that wants to drive the corona psychosis, the mass formation, for many reasons, profiteering and control, and there's myriad reasons, as we well know. But the system really doesn't want professionals sharing and openly talking about it, whatever about the generic public. So LinkedIn came in the hardest. I found that as well. Insta, I don't use much. And yeah, I'm getting into it, but I haven't used it much. So that was okay. Twitter, got a couple of kind of strikes, but they were bizarre ones, and I'm okay. And Facebook is comical. Facebook is literally a joke. I mean, I'll give you an example. I shared a video today, just a video, and it was on a mainstream like CNN, and it was an interview with Mr. Gates. And it was the one from 2020 I saw at the time, and I was shocked before everything went completely insane. And it was the one where he said at the end, this doesn't end until pretty much everyone in the whole world, like the whole world, is vaccinated. He actually said that. And I shared that clip again, and I just made a comment to how sinister and disturbing that video clip really was. And I immediately got fact-checked by Facebook, not deleted post, fact-checked by a Lithuanian fact-checking outfit. And it was in a foreign language. And it basically said that that clip was missing context. So Facebook is just bizarre. I've gotten blocked on Facebook for a week for sharing literally memes. A good example, I shared a picture of Hermann Goring from the Nuremberg trials, and it just had a quote from Goring, and I had no comment on it, and I got a ban for a week. That meme was in their system, as you're not allowed to talk about that. And it was just Goering saying, you know, it works the same in every country. You simply create a threat, a fear in the people, and then anyone who questions you and counters or argues, you say that they are undermining the security of our country, and you turn the people on them. It works the same in every country. And that, it may not be word for word, but that is a valid quote, I believe. But I got a ban for sharing that.
That's insane. That's
Yeah,
insane. Yeah, you shouldn't be getting banned for sharing something like that, and I don't think I should get
historical.
banned for sharing, you know, scientific data on LinkedIn. But you know, that's the world that we live in now, and that's why too. You know, people are coming forward, but they are not saying. Most people, anyway, are not saying everything that they want to say because they're afraid, and they're not just afraid of getting banned on Twitter. They're afraid of, you know, what other people will say about them if they express their feelings or express how they, you know, truly feel. They're afraid of getting fired from their employer. You know, there's a multitude of reasons why, you know, people are not saying certain things, but one of them is definitely because they don't want to get banned. And you know, like I was saying, like I lost my LinkedIn account, you know, so now, you know, I really don't want to lose some of my other accounts because my LinkedIn account was building up, you know, pretty good, pretty quickly. I think I had over about 10,000 followers on there, and it was you know, gaining pretty quickly too. So you know, I think that's where people's heads are at these days. When they are saying something online, they're being very careful, which is unfortunate because, I mean, not that we don't want people to, you know, really think about what they have to say before they say it, but they should be allowed to express, you know, what they feel, especially if they're, you know, quoting scientific data, and not have this fear of like backlash, you know. And that's, you know, been an ongoing thing throughout COVID, has been this censorship thing. So I'm really happy that you brought up, those 2 points about YouTube. So again, I guess the two that you said is that, so you can talk about how the vaccine does not prevent transmission, and now you can talk about how lockdowns are, ineffective, or at least, seem to cause more harm than good, which is, a good thing, because we should be talking about those two issues.
Yeah, and they're in mainstream as well. And that's maybe one of the reasons they had to drop it, because it's leaked into mainstream, even though the mainstream and legacy media have been an absolute disgrace in not covering all aspects of the news, because they self-censored as well. It was shocking. But because they're leaking out little bits of those things, YouTube, I guess, rolled over. The one primary one left in YouTube that's still there is questioning the WHO, and I think questioning the severity of SARS-CoV-2, or comparing it to the common cold, or even maybe comparing it to flu. So they've got a real get-out clause there for censorship. That's a real blanket one. You're not allowed to question the severity, which is truly shocking.
That is shocking, because, I mean, certainly, the Delta variant was, devastating for a lot of people. But, if you look at Omicron, I think it was Vinny Prasad that started calling it Omicold. It does seem to be, less severe in nature overall. And just by, having that statement saying that, Omicron is less severe than Delta or some of the other strains, people will start to, come at you and say that, you're not taking this seriously enough, like you're downplaying it. And like, all we're doing is we're, stating that different viruses have, different effects on the body. And some of them, are more virulent and more severe than others. And, certainly it's conceivable that coronaviruses are like the common cold. And in fact, and I'm sure you know this, Ivor, is that, 3 of the common cold viruses that have been around for forever are coronaviruses. So, it's only, logical to, discuss these different strains and to compare them to the flu. And yet, doing that as a scientist, will now get you banned from certain, social media channels, or, your colleagues will more or less just like ostracize you. So, it's something that I think that we should be able to discuss. And on that subject, like, what are your kind of thoughts on, the current strains that are more prevalent right now? And do you think that they are less infectious and less severe than some of the earlier strains like Delta?
Yeah, well, the earlier strains were more impactful, but I mean, not just because of the strains they were, but they were relatively new in their nature. And yeah, there's four primary coronavirus family. This is an addition. And as Professor Bede Stadler, I interviewed many times, he's the vaccine pope of Switzerland. So he's a top immunologist, developed vaccines, pharma guy, but he decided to be honest about this. And as he said at the start, around 80% of the people are de facto immune. Now, it doesn't mean they won't get a positive PCR, etc., but they're de facto immune, most of the population, from prior cross immunity. They might get a positive PCR right up their nose at the back of their brain, but they're not going to get really infected. They're not going to be spreading. They're not going to get symptoms. And that turned out to be entirely true, even from the first couple of newest strains. The impact ignored around 80 or 90% effectively of the whole of Europe, 400 million people, even though there was massive spread. So that's the first thing. The later strains, we already had this huge immunity, new immunity built up in the population. So you can't really judge the later ones like with like. But sure, Omicron came in September, I think it was the 21, when it was all being talked about. The South African lady, I forget her name, professor, and very much involved in COVID, came out and said, look, we've got this new strain and it's got 4 or 5 times less impact, and we're not even vaccinated yet beyond like 15%. It's not that. We're seeing 4 or 5 times less impact in hospitals and mortality. Great news for the world. Omicron clearly, in our wave, is clearly way less severe and more like a flu or maybe sub-flu. But we saw, I don't know if you recall, Mike, media in UK and all over the world attacked her. They didn't want the good news. That was for whatever reason. And she was dismissed and attacked and aggressively interviewed and then pulled out of the press. But it turned out after a couple of months that it was so obvious that she was correct that they began to acknowledge and admit, even on legacy media, admit that Omicron was far less impactful. But the reluctance that the system would even admit good news. I mean, it's like they were addicted to the hysteria. They just couldn't let it go.
Yeah, I think that, I guess, you know, if they put out like a good news story like that, it may not, you know, produce as much hysteria, and consequently they'll, you know, their viewership will likely decrease because of that, you know. But if you put out something that, you know, people have to follow, that, you know, there's a new virus coming out, and this or new strain, I should say, and this strain is, you know, way more virulent, way more severe, you know, makes you much more sick. And you say, you know, stay tuned, we're going to have experts come on and talk about this, and, you know, talk about how, you know, dangerous and severe this, you know, particular strain is. That's going to, you know, increase viewership. But if you just say, hey, you know, this strain is, you know, not as severe as the other strains, you know, if you guys, you know, take care of your metabolic health, you get your sleep, you eat right, you know, you exercise, you take your vitamin D, you do all the things that you're, you know, should be doing anyway, regardless of COVID or not COVID, you know, you should be able to get through this most of the time. I mean, of course, you know, even like the seasonal flu is going to knock out some people sometimes. That just happens. But, you know, we don't shut down the whole, you know, country or the whole system. We just proceed on, and we understand, and we just take that risk that, you know, in, you know, during the winter time especially, you know, there might be a chance that you catch a cold, but, you know, people just live on. But unfortunately, we've gotten away from that now, and the hysteria is out there. And I think that that's what's happening with, you know, the media outlets, and that's probably what happened with this lady that you're talking about now, which is, you know, very unfortunate. And one, you know, thing that I wanted to ask you about, Ivor, was because in Canada now there's sort of, I guess, a threat, you could say, to like bring back masks. You know, that's what's being discussed, especially here in Ontario. And I know Canada's been a bit of a laughing stock during this whole thing, but you know, what are your thoughts on that? You know, obviously from just looking at you, I can tell that, you know, I understand what your thoughts are going to be a little bit, but, you know, what are your thoughts on bringing back masks, and with that too, you know, anything to disrupt the transmission of the virus?
No, from an engineering kind of statistical, or, well, not statistical significance, is something makes a difference that's real, but it may be tiny. And that's why we always have engineering significance, not just that there's a difference, but that it's meaningful. If there is a difference with masks, it's so small it cannot be measured. And there's a load of junk studies have come out. I mean, an incredible number of literally junk studies published, peer-reviewed, and they use associational data, and it's all flawed and confounded. But the one RCT in Denmark, the DanMask, answered the question. And basically, there was no statistically significant even difference between mask wearing and not. And that was the only RCT done. And it took 2 months delay to get published. And the authors admitted publicly, essentially, that no one wanted to publish it because the result came out the wrong way. So the system just didn't want that answer. And eventually they got published, and they had to change the wording. And it was the most absurd thing. They said, well, we didn't really find a significant, but, you know, it appears that maybe there is some benefit. I mean, it was literally made up to get published. So we're talking about a system that the bias is so powerful, it simply will reject data that it just doesn't like. And we saw all over the world countless compares, case control compares of masks and not masks. And all over the world, hundreds of countries, even all the counties of America, I think, over 100,000 people, Any way you looked, you could never find a signal for mask effectiveness. That answers the question. North Dakota and South Dakota were one of the most amusing compares. We had a couple of their waves, and they were exactly the same in the wave. To the day, the shape of the curve, the magnitude of the curve. They behaved the exact same. And they were the same people in the same region, so there wasn't a seasonal difference. They were the same culture, same age distribution, 1 million people in each, perfect control. And they had exact same performance, but one went with business closures and lockdowns and masks, and one did not do any of that. It was like Florida, and there was the exact same outcome. And I could go on all day with those examples. There is zero support for it. And we now know, or we knew for a long time actually, it's aerosol spread like influenza. It's ubiquitous. Clouds of ultra small particles that are unaffected by masks come out of people who are infectious. And it's basically everywhere. I mean, even in Italy, there was a closed order of nuns. You know, these nuns that stay and they just get their food sent into them, but they won't speak or mix. They all went down with a COVID outbreak back in 2020. And they're in an enclosed order. And then we had the people that after a double negative PCR, they checked all the semen on a ship. There were 2 of these actually. And then around 6-7 weeks into their trip, they kind of broke out with COVID, and they got antibody tests later and says, yeah, they broke out with COVID, and everyone was scratching their heads. And that speaks to dormancy, I think, rather than just the ubiquitous nature. But the whole thing was absurd mechanistically because it's aerosol spread. And you know, if you put on any of these masks and you take a vape, aerosol, which is the vape, comes through the mask and out the corners in a huge cloud. I mean, some of these videos, the guy's head, you can't see it. And he's got a mask on, he blows out the vape. His whole head is invisible for a few seconds. That's how big the cloud of vape comes out. It's just, I can't state it strongly enough that masks do nothing in real world. And yet they ignore it. Everyone driving the hysteria wants masks. And I'll finish on one quick thing, Mike. I knew we were in serious trouble in the world in terms of the world had gone insane. When in Europe, and we knew it was a seasonal virus, and we knew it seasonally had collapsed for the summer, like influenzas, like all other coronaviruses. Even with hyper testing, it was gone until next October, November. And I thought, Mike, it's very important in the next few months, while there is no hysteria because it's gone until the winter. We knew that. They knew that. It's very important that we talk about the lockdowns that just occurred. While things are quiet, we need to talk, and look back and say, this was wrong. And then what happened, Mike, in Europe in the middle of the summer when it was gone? They brought in mandatory masks then, literally in the end of June or into July. All countries of Europe within a couple of weeks brought in the masks and brought them in with fines and prison sentences. It's not like even they brought them in and say, hey, let's wear masks, even though the hospitals are empty and nothing's going on, which is insane, right? But they brought them in with an iron fist behind them in the middle of the summer. And that's when I knew, whatever about conspiracy theories, I knew either the people running this from above, from all these councils and, foundations or WHO, either they literally are gone insane or there's malice. In other words, we want to keep this thing going until we get the mass medications, and we don't want this going away. So in this summer lull, there's a danger people will say, oh, it's seasonal. Oh, it's kind of like a flu. And we'll lose the people's fear and we won't be able to rev it up in the winter. So I think there was a concerted effort to keep people in pandemic mode through those dry months of the summer when nothing was happening. And it sounds a bit conspiracy theory. You can't deny what I just described. It's either insanity or it's absolute corruption and malice.
Yeah,
there's no other.
It's definitely disturbing to think about. And just coming back to the data on the mask too. So I had posted something recently because there was a Cochrane review done in 2020, so fairly recently. And, we know that Cochrane reviews are, to, the academics, the absolute gold standard for, making any kind of public policy-based decision. And they said in the Cochrane review that they don't believe that masks prevent influenza. They couldn't find any data to support that. And then now you're saying too that the only RCT that we have, so the only randomized control trial that we have for COVID and masks would be the Danish study. And in that study, it appeared that they didn't find any statistically significant difference, but there was some, I guess, maybe back and forth or some difficulty in getting that paper published. And in doing so, they changed their wording a little bit to favor mask wearing. Is that pretty accurate?
That's exactly it. And we made the movie, and it features in that, actually. Our movie, if you go to covidchroniclesmovie.com, all one word, because you won't find it in the search engine because of censorship. And YouTube, 2 days after the release of our movie, we did a Kickstarter. We got around $160,000. We made the movie, South Africa, Ireland. We interviewed people in Switzerland and UK. So we made a pretty good movie considering a very moderate budget. But 2 days after it was released, if any of it went on YouTube, it was already mounted in the algorithm to instant strike you. So 2 days after the release, it was already loaded into YouTube's algorithm to automatically strike anyone who uploaded it. So that'll show you the strength of the machine. But in there, we cover that, and it's exactly as you say, Mike. We have the clip from the guy, and they did let it be known that they couldn't get it published, but it showed no positive impact. And then in the end, the wording had changed to say, may give some benefit, even though it wasn't statistically significant. They changed the wording to be suggestive that there was something there.
Yeah, I've looked at some or so there was one, I guess, review that I looked at recently, and again, the wording was very, very ambiguous. They didn't really say that they found a difference in mask versus non-mask wearing, but they more or less still suggested it. Like, it was a very, very strange study. So again, like, I guess the bottom line here is that we do not have a RCT that definitively states that mask wearing decreases the transmission of COVID. That's, I guess, just a simple fact, correct?
Absolutely. And to put a real point on it, we know now, well, we knew a long time ago, but even the orthodoxy is admitting now it's aerosol spread, it's seasonal, it's the same mechanism as influenza. And we have 40 years of RCTs, many of them, and countless studies looking for an advantage with masks with influenza. And the sum rolled up total of that is there's nothing there. And we know that applies to SARS-CoV-2 as well, because it's aerosol spread, it's the same mechanisms, it's even the same seasonality and same time of year broadly. Coronavirus and influenza family virus are very similar in many ways. And so the 40 years of history said masks will not work. And then they did one RCT, which just verified that. And then the data around the world from all the people who use masks versus not use masks finally put the nail in the coffin. There is no questioning this. It's over. And yet here we are. And here you are in Canada talking about masks again. Like, is it insanity or is it evil?
Yeah, it's really disturbing to think about, but yeah, that is a big threat here right now in Canada, or Ontario at least, is that, you have the hashtag of bring back masks is, basically going on Twitter every day. But I did want to chat with you, a little bit more about COVID. But there's one more point that I want to make there too, because you're talking about publication bias, and I did a video on this fairly recently, about a month ago or so. I remember Ben Goldacker did something. This was maybe 10-15 years ago, and he talked about the publication bias for antidepressants. And you know, what happened was there was a I think, and I'm going to fudge the numbers a little tiny bit, but they're going to be pretty accurate. But he found that there was about 38 studies on antidepressants that indicated that they were relatively ineffective. And out of those studies, like 37, or sorry, about one of them was published stating that they're ineffective. So, I mean, they held back about 37 studies.
Yeah.
And then there was about 38 positive studies, and the opposite happened. So they published about 37 of those, and then they, you know, held back about one. And this is, you know, in PubMed. I've talked about it, and again, it's nothing new. Like, I think this study is from, it could be as back as far as like 2008-ish. You
Yeah.
know, I know that Ben Goldacker is more popular in your part of the world than where I am, but he's a UK guy, right? I think
He's UK. Yeah, he wrote a couple of books on all this
yeah,
kind of corruption in science. He's a
yeah,
good guy, but he's up against the machine.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
And you know, it's
I
just an interesting. Oh, sorry.
no, I was just gonna say it's just one, you know, more example, like you had brought up, you know, the Danish study. And so it's not like this has only happened for this Danish study where,
Oh,
you know,
no.
it's happens all the time in medicine. And that was my whole point. But go ahead, Ivor.
Yeah, I was going to say there that the Cochrane collaboration, which you mentioned, Professor Peter Gotcha, who not only was a trial expert, he became an MD, went and did medicine. So he's an MD, a professor, and an expert in trial design and interpretation statistics. So Gotcha is incredible mind. And he was in Cochrane, and they began to find out things like there was a statin kind of meta-analysis across the trials that said there's no real evidence of life prolonging, and it was problematic. Pharma didn't like it. But long story short, what happened was actually Bill Gates dropped, I think, $1.5 million into Cochrane. And within a couple of weeks, Gotcha and others were let go. So this is another big problem we have that's not new, but it's accelerated. Another example is the 2009 swine flu. Spiel or Der Spiegel magazine, which is a big deal in Germany, in 2010 did a huge 10-page article, which is still online. It's amazing. If you look up Der Spiegel swine flu, you'll get it. And they absolutely ripped apart the corruption between the WHO, and up to 25 reps from pharma met with the WHO in Geneva, I think in 2009. And the WHO dropped the severity clause from the pandemic definition. And I mean, it was just an article that showed the corruption was insane. But Der Spiegel during COVID has been useless. But Gates Foundation pretty much dropped in a big ton of money there in 2018, I think, or 19. So it's almost like all these different bodies that do try and do investigative reporting, or like Cochrane, it's almost like they're targeted and funded, and then suddenly they lose the interest in questioning the narratives.
Yeah. Yeah, that's again very, very disturbing. But one thing that you
Mm.
mentioned there, you know, is statins. So I think that's a good segue to cardiovascular disease because, you know, as you kind of stated at the beginning of the show, that was your primary interest
Mm.
of research, you know, before COVID came along. And so, you know, one thing that I wanted to ask you about, you know, was the standard test that you talked about at the beginning of the show. So, you know, generally speaking, in Canada, the tests that we order, we have, you know, your HDL, your LDL, a calculated LDL, your triglycerides, and you get your ratio. You know, that's typically what, you know, consists of a lipid profile panel. But in addition to that, you know, a lot of people now are talking about an ApoB and an ApoA1. And I noticed that Peter Attia recently was talking about lipoprotein particle A as well. So I just kind of wanted to ask you, you know, a little bit about that. So in terms of the, you know, what are the best tests to order, you know, what do you think are the best cardiovascular test to order? Again, we're just talking about cholesterol. We understand there's blood pressure and there's a million different things that go into, you know, contributing to cardiovascular disease, but talking about just lipids and cholesterol only, you know, what do you feel are the best tests for people to order?
Right. Well, the standard cholesterol panel, the basic one, cheap and cheerful. And the LDL value doesn't really mean much or anything on its own in isolation. We know that now. And the total cholesterol is largely meaningless. But certainly the triglyceride and HDL. And in Canada, I think you're kind of, are you millimoles like Europe or
Yeah,
milligrams like
millimoles,
you're
millimoles.
millimole? Very
Yeah.
good. So in millimoles, as an example, myself, my wife are around 7 total. We're around 4 LDL and we're around 1.7 to 2.1 HDL.
Okay.
So the race, hmm?
I said, okay. Go
Yeah.
ahead. Go ahead.
So the best values you can get are the triglyceride divided by the HDL, that ratio. And in millimoles, you want to be down around 0.6 or lower. You know, that would be ideal. And that's the most powerful predictive measure from all the cholesterol measures. And then the total divided by the HDL, just similar, kind of below 5 is a guideline, maybe down at 4 is another ratio that's very powerful. And that's pretty much it from the cholesterol panel. And the reason, it's quite simple, the reason those ratios are so powerfully predictive and great things to watch is nothing to do with cholesterol. It's just the cholesterol system responds to whether you're insulin resistant or insulin sensitive. And that's the driver of most of the heart disease problem. So cholesterol just gives you an indirect kind of proxy to look at whether you're insulin resistant. So they're the useful measures. LDL, we have people with LDL over 10 millimole, total 16, that kind of numbers in their 60s with clean arteries. You know, the LDL on its own and the cholesterol is a loose correlation with heart disease, and it's not a causal, meaningful relationship. So that's the cholesterols. The LP little a, a brief word on that. LP little a is not a risk factor in indigenous populations around the world when it's studied. If they're eating traditional diets and living traditionally, LP little a doesn't mean anything. That'll tell you a lot. Whereas in the West, it tends to be higher can be bad. But again, it's not the LPA that's causing the badness. But people with high LP little a are a certain genetic heritage that tends to be more susceptible. So that's one of the reasons we believe it correlates. So if it's very high, certainly be careful and check all your other measures. But the key measures to check for us are your insulin and blood glucose. So they are the primary measures to get. And if you get your fasting insulin and your fasting glucose, it's not that powerful, but you can put your insulin and glucose into a HOMA calculator. You can Google it online, HOMA calculator, and you'll get it online. And you put in your insulin and your glucose. And together, a bit like the ratio HDL to trigger, together they're more powerful. And you want to be below 1.2 or even below 1 in that HOMA. And that's really powerful. It's a very good metric for health. And the ultimate, though, is to drink 75 grams of glucose and 2 hours later get a blood insulin. Don't worry about the glucose so much, blood insulin. And that is your 2-hour post-glucose insulin. And that's an incredible measure. If that's below 30 microunits, you're non-diabetic insulin sensitive. If it's above 40 microunits, you are type 2 diabetic, even if your doctor says you're not. And if it's in between, it's a little indeterminate, but you want to be getting it down if it's 36 or 7. That's an incredible measure. But you do need to drink 75 grams of glucose, and you need to get the measurement 2 hours later. And you need to be sedentary for those 2 hours. You can't be running around or it'll disturb it. That's a killer measure.
So you don't think that having high LDL is necessarily bad then? Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. It's not really a matter of think. I mean, from the MESA study, a cardiologist, a friend of mine in Texas recently, brilliant individual, Kerm Nazir, he's a big proponent of the calcium scan. He published a paper from the MESA coronary calcification through different ethnic origination people study. MEISA is huge. It's used to create risk algorithms and everything. But he did a study and found, unsurprisingly to me, that the people with higher LDL as a group in that study of atherosclerosis, heart disease, as a group, they were barely discernible from the people with low LDL. And we've countless studies showing this, that for all of people's belief systems, that higher LDL correlates with worse outcomes. And sometimes it does. When you really look closely, and even at familial hypercholesterolemics who have very high LDL, even within those guys, there's ones with massive heart disease, and it's actually due to blood clotting. It's not due to the cholesterol. Genetically, familial hypercholesterolemics, yes, they have high cholesterol, but much more distinctive with them is a much more active platelet aggregation and clotting. So yet again, the cholesterol is a proxy. But back to the question, we have countless examples of data showing the LDL on its own does not have any real meaning. But when it's high, it is a good hint to look more carefully at the really important things like leptin and insulin and maybe homocysteine. And, you know, it might be a trigger like high Lp(a) to say, I could be susceptible. I better check the proper measures very carefully.
If you had high LDL, would you then get an ApoB, ApoA1 done?
ApoB, it's interesting, in the cholesterol industry, they decided the game was up on LDL Classic, LDLC, a few years ago, because what I just described was getting so embarrassing, they decided it was time to retire it. Now, a lot of doctors still think it's important, but the top end of the industry, the statin cholesterol industry, decided to move on because they had a new champion. That's ApoB. So ApoB, similar to LDLP, is the count of the particles, the low-density lipoprotein, LDL particles, rather than the old test, which smashed all the particles up and looked at how much cholesterol came out of them, right? This new test, ApoB or LDLP, counts the number of particles, and it is a better predictor of risk. But the killer question is why? And the answer is quite straightforward. Because LDLP and ApoB, when they're high, are an even better proxy for insulin resistance than the old cholesterol measures were. So again, it's all about insulin resistance, but you're using the cholesterol measures to indirectly look at your insulin resistance. Not 100%, but overwhelmingly. I mean, I have one paper I sent out back in 2014. You love this, Mike. High ApoB was found to be a 16 times multiplier for being insulin resistant. Like, you know, smoking, you're 15 times as likely to have lung cancer, and it's seen to be the strongest, you know, risk factor for lung cancer in the universe. It's one of the examples of an incredibly high risk ratio. Well, this paper showed 16 times more likely to be insulin resistant when your ApoB was high. It just answers the question. And if you look through that study and you look through all of the metrics for all of the groups, you can see it clear as day. High insulin, bad triglyceride over HDL ratios, yada, yada, yada. And the high-risk group with the high ApoB, compared to the other group, they have the same LDL on average, women and men. You just, everywhere you go, you find this fundamental truth, you know? So it's a better measure. It's more accurate, but it's still reflecting insulin resistance mostly. That's most of its value.
Okay, so you think the ApoB, it's most of its value is to predict insulin resistance, not necessarily cholesterol.
Yeah, and I'll give one example because people might find that surprising because it's the new kid on the block, like Lp(a), ApoB, it's the proper cholesterol measurement. But I'll tell you something, and I argue with the cholesterol guys for 10 years, and usually when I make a point, they'll argue against me back. Like you'd expect, they're defending cholesterol as a really important thing. But there's one they never reply to me, right? They have no reply. And there's a reason, because there is no reply. So I'll tell you it. The Catavans and the CEng men are people over in another part of the world, right? They're human, same as us, a little bit different, but they're the same machine. They have the lowest heart disease pretty much on the planet. If you look at their calcification all the way up to 80 years of age, there's almost no calcification in studies that have done coronary calcium scans, and they have no heart attacks. So they're the lowest heart disease over here, Catavan, CEng. And then if you go to America, it's pretty much nearly the highest heart disease in the world, right? So we agree that it's riddled with heart disease. So now you've got two groups of humans, the lowest and the highest. If ApoB or LDLP was relevant, there is no question in this universe, but that obviously the lowest heart disease people in the world, the Catavans, must have a lower ApoB or LDLP, right? Has to. They have the same or higher as the Americans on average. In other words, you've got the highest heart disease and the lowest in the world, and they share the same value of the thing you're trying to pretend is a risk factor. And they never answer me on that because there is no answer. It's as close to a scientific proof as you can actually get in this world.
Okay, because I have seen a lot of prominent nutritionists. Like I don't know if you're familiar with Lane Norton, but he's said recently that he's reversed his position on cholesterol and LDL, and that he thinks that LDL should be lower. And then I've also heard Peter Attia say recently, that he was discussing statins and LPLA, and basically his argument was that even though statins don't lower LPLA, they lower LDL cholesterol so much that it would still be an effective treatment for preventing heart disease. But and again, I listen to all sides, but your stance on that is that these guys have it wrong, and that LDL for the most part is not associated independently with heart disease. Is that correct?
Is in any meaningful way that would matter? Yes, and everything does link to everything, and the cholesterol system is complex, and the cholesterol is engaged in the atherosclerotic process, so it's not like it has nothing to do with it. But in terms of meaningfully affecting your risk, it's just a peripheral interacting system that is not where the gold is at all. And I think, in fairness to Attia personally, on the record, admitted he was obsessed with lipoproteins, almost his exact words. And he's mega buddies with Tom Dayspring, who's the mega pharma drug cholesterol king, the lipidologist Thomas Dayspring. So I think a bit like COVID, when people got completely obsessed with COVID, and you're standing outside looking at the data thinking, wow, I think it's similar thing with lipidology. They're fascinated, obsessed, and they believe it's like an ideology that we can use drugs and use things to push down this number, and this is how we can affect and control risk. Where, as a problem-solving engineer, I look at all data and I stand above it, and I see the cholesterol thing is effectively a distraction. And I'll give you an example here of Thomas Dayspring, who's Attia's buddy, and they're thick as thieves, as we say in Ireland. Doesn't mean they're thieves. Thick as thieves mean they're just completely engaged.
I've heard that expression before.
Oh, you have? Sorry, I wasn't sure if it was just an Irish thing. And Thomas Dayspring, I screen captured a reply he gave to me. Now, I was being a little sneaky because I'm a corporate guy, and he's a clever guy himself, so I wouldn't feel sorry for him. But I was arguing with him and maneuvering him. And then I got him to reply to me, because I sent NHANES data, US data. And I said, well, XYZ, how in the name of God can you explain this? And he replied to me in a tweet, and he basically said, I kept the tweet in case he deleted it. This is the big cholesterol guy, top of the world, Attia's buddy. And he said, basically, he said, yes, NHANES data demonstrates that most heart attacks are directly due to insulin resistance. Right? That's important because that is true. And he said the second thing is that LDL-C is a useless biomarker for heart disease. So he also said that.
And he
And
tweeted that
that's
publicly?
it.
He tweeted that publicly?
Yeah, I put the tweet in many of my talks in 2016, 17, 18, and then I forgot about it. But I used to put up his tweet as a slide, and I got a big laugh because I'm surprised he said it, but he did. Now, he would try and maintain that LDLP is relevant, or ApoB, but that's just dropping the old scam and kind of getting with the new scam, largely.
Okay.
I mean, he never replied to me about the Catavans. He would not reply to me on the Catavan point because it's devastating. And he would not reply on the 16 times hazard ratio for insulin resistance for high ApoB, which says it all, right? It basically just tells you it's about the insulin resistance. It's obvious. He wouldn't reply to that. And in fact,
how do you feel about hemoglobin A1C? Like, do you feel like that's a good measurement for insulin resistance, or what are your thoughts on that?
Very, very, very poor, because by the time your A1C is showing it, you've had diabetes for 15 plus years. And we know that from the data. And I interviewed Dr. Joseph Kraft when he was 94, I think, in Chicago. I flew to Chicago.
To interrupt you there. So which test would you order then for insulin resistance? I think you may have mentioned this earlier, but just say it again, just because it is really important.
Really quick, and interestingly, I learned about the 2-hour insulin, which is the ultimate. And there is a hack. I'm not advising people do this, but people say, but my doctor won't give me an oral glucose tolerance and an insulin 2 hours after drinking the 75-gram glucose. There is a hack where you can arrange, say, to get a testing at your doctor at 11 a.m., say, and quietly, secretly drink the glucose at 9 a.m. approximately, and you'll get yourself a 2-hour insulin. And then when the insulin comes back and the doctor goes, oh, your fasting insulin is very high, you can just smile and say, well, actually, it's 2-hour insulin. And he'll go, huh? But they don't know about insulin testing. So the 2-hour insulin is the ultimate measure. And Peter Attia, he was on Rhoda or Rona, that lady, attractive lady who's big in the health sphere.
Oh, Rhonda Patrick.
Rhonda Patrick. He was on, she was interviewing him, and he was sitting there as wise, as only Attia can be. And she asked him, this is so funny. I downloaded this video because this is like keeping Thomas Dayspring's reply. So really briefly, I went to Chicago to interview Dr. Joseph Kraft, who had done something, was it 16,000 5-hour insulin assays in the 70s and 80s. And he discovered there's 5 different patterns of insulin response after drinking the glucose. And he discovered diabetes type 2 was vastly bigger than we thought it was, because his test was like the 2-hour insulin. So I learned from him personally the 2-hour insulin, because his mathematical guru, Dr. Z, I think, found out that you don't really need to do a full 5-hour pattern, because the 2-hour insulin will pretty much tell you what pattern the person is, and it's much easier. So that's where I found out about it. But years later, Attia was on Rhonda Patrick. This is so funny. And she said to him, if you only had one measurement for longevity and health, what would it be? And Attia sat there, most wise. He almost stroked his chin. He didn't, but that was the feel. And he said, I think an insulin measurement 2 hours after taking a glucose load. Like he just thought that up. But he obviously got it through me from Dr. Kraft. He didn't just make it up. So there's a lot of that goes on in this sphere as well. But that it is a hugely important measurement.
So that's what you should do, though, is drink 75 grams of glucose and then test your insulin levels 2 hours later. That would be the best test. That's what you're saying.
I'm not advising because you're telling people to drink something or eat something. I won't do that, but that's how one could do it. And some people, especially if they're diabetic, will get a sugar crash. You obviously shouldn't be driving, maybe, because you take 75. Now it's only the same as I don't know, I think less than 2 cans of Coca-Cola. So it's not like poisonous, right? But still, That's the way you can do it. And if you have a blood spot insulin, like I think Meridian Valley Labs in America, I'm not sure they ship to Canada, they send you a pack for a 5-hour insulin and you get the
Okay.
glucose and you can do a full 5-hour on a blood spot and send it back to them. So
Okay.
there's lots of ways. Yeah.
Okay. And obviously, I mean, it seems pretty obvious from this conversation anyway that you're not a fan of statins whatsoever. You know, I had Kevin Bass on the show. I'm not sure if you're familiar
Oh,
with him. And
you're
so
bringing back memories like
I,
after 2.5
like I
years of
say,
COVID.
I like to listen to all sides. I like to listen to everyone. And so
Oh, yeah.
Kevin, I don't know if he's still doing it, but he had initiated very publicly, initiated that he had started a statin regime, and he wasn't getting side effects. But then he did, and I hope this wasn't the case, but I know that he did end up in hospital. I think it might have been with COVID or something like that in the summertime. He was pretty sick, but I'm not sure if he is still doing the statin thing or not. But I do appreciate though your viewpoint on that. So and then coming back to something else in terms of like supplementation. I know we only have a few minutes left, but red yeast rice basically is a statin in essence. I mean, it's going to inhibit HMG-CoA reductase, which is the mechanisms of action of statins. So you would basically think that you would get the exact same side effects, and I think that that's been proven more or less overall, is that if you do take red yeast rice extract, you are going to get the same side effects of statins, which tend to be myalgias and fatigue seem to be the biggest ones. Those are the reasons why most people stop taking them anyway. And myalgias, for people who don't know, is generally when people get pain, but for whatever reason it's pain in the calf that seems to be that is associated with statins. And then a lot of people also just get fatigue because they have been shown that they do deplete you of CoQ10. And ironically, actually, I tweeted out something yesterday. There was a pretty good meta-analysis that showed that supplementation with CoQ10 can be effective for alleviating fatigue. So, you don't want to be, which makes total sense that, if you're giving someone CoQ10 and they experience less fatigue, then obviously if you're giving them a drug that decreases their ability to, synthesize CoQ10, that they would probably get fatigue as a side effect. But do you take any supplements, or do you do anything that would change your cholesterol level anyway, any of your ratios, or do you just basically do everything through diet?
Yeah, diet pretty much. I mean, I do believe in if someone has disease, obviously you're going to go much harder into supplementing and being careful. I'm a little sloppy that way. Absolutely nothing for cholesterol, because it's effectively, to me, after 10 years in the field and probably well over 1,000 papers on lipids, and I've done talks on the whole operation lipid system. After all of that, and I'm unbiased, to me, it's nonsense, pretty much. I mean, it's very fascinating and interesting. Lipidology and all of these systems are extraordinary. But like I said about insulin resistance, it's not where the game is at. And in the British Medical Journal a few years ago, someone or a bunch of docs did a paper, and they went through all the statin trials, and they wanted to answer the question that I'm interested in. What's the life extension on average for taking statins for 5 years? And the answer was a few days on average. Now, no engineer would take statins seriously. And a lot of people complained about that paper, and they complained about the way it was done, though their methodology was so simple. They took their survival curves and they read off them. And it's completely legitimate. So for all the complaints of that paper, it was never retracted, and it's there, published, peer-reviewed to this day. You can't question it. And it's what I observed from the trials as well. I was always trying to look at the statin trials, and yeah, there's lower events, but some of those are subjective. So there's less revascularizations, less stents. But I mean, all the doctors involved, it's not blinded, because they can see from the patient's like lipids who is on the drug and who's not. So then a guy who comes in who clearly is not on the drug because their cholesterol stayed the same and he's feeling, a bit of a pain, you can assume that could be a heart thing and send him into the cath lab and do all the stuff. And the guy who comes in with the cholesterol that's right down, you know, he's on the drug. He shouldn't really have a problem. Well, maybe it's just a stomach issue. And then, you know, maybe that guy doesn't go in. Do you see the subjectivity? So I was always interested, what's the life extension? That's a hard measure.
Yeah,
And I was
I like
seeing
that
across all of the
analogy too.
trials, I'm not seeing Jack. And then that British Medical Journal publication, they did the work for me. And that's the answer. So how could I take that seriously?
Yeah.
I just couldn't
Well,
as an engineer.
I think
That's
that's
it.
a good place to end, Ivor. Can you tell everybody where they can find you online, where they can read about you and find more about your research?
Right. Well, I'd say just my name, Ivor Cummins. If you kind of Google it, you get my YouTube as my main thing, and Twitter, and thefatemperor.com. But I don't always put a lot there. I sometimes go straight to YouTube or Twitter and all that stuff. And COVIDchroniclesmovie.com. It's free now. It has been for a year and a half, and it's in 6 languages. So we made this movie and full of professors. We only really use professors of medicine or epidemiology or mathematics or immunology. So it's a clean movie and it tells the story of COVID.
Well, thank you for sharing all your knowledge today. Super appreciate it. And thank you everyone for listening. And I'll be back again next week.